Good afternoon, and welcome to our second Democracy Dialogue event of 2022. My name is Ian Balcom. I'm the Provost of the University of Virginia, and I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon. As many of you know, these are a series of conversations that we've been organizing over the course of the past several years with the fundamental goal of strengthening democracy here and around the world through civil debate. Before we get going, I want to acknowledge that many people have made these dialogues possible, and we're deeply grateful for their support. In particular, I want to thank the George and Judy Marcus Democracy Praxis Fund, Ingrid and David Hang, and James Murray Jr. For all of their generous support. And I'd like to express my gratitude to the University of Virginia's Karsh Institute of Democracy and Miller Center for co-sponsoring this event. Today's conversation will explore the ways in which we can measure the health of democracy, both in the US and around the world. It's hard to think of something more timely. On any day for many years that have passed, for years that will be coming, and I think for many of us, particularly on this day. The fate and the future of democracy is on all of our minds. But can we actually measure its well-being? So it turns out there are ways. There are a number of indices that have been developed over recent years to assess the vibrancy, the stability, and the health of democratic institutions and cultures. They've measured different things using different metrics. Some look at trends in economic freedom, while others focus on electoral participation, human security, or civic health. In reality, all of these factors play into the health of democracy. Today's conversation will explore a few of these indices, comparing and contrasting methodologies and findings to comment on the state of democracy around the world. As I mentioned a moment ago, it would be impossible to discuss these indices without recognizing their real-world implications for current events surrounding us. Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, China's relationship with Taiwan, waning trust in institutions in the United States. Our hope is that today's session can result in a dialogue about the overall health of democracy, as well as exploring what's at stake and why it's important to measure democracy. We're fortunate to be joined by a very eminent panel representing 4 organizations that produce widely respected publications seeking to address these questions. Michael J. Abramovitz is the president of Freedom House, a nonpartisan voice dedicated to promoting democracy. Formerly, he directed the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Levin Institute for Holocaust Education, and before that, he led the museum's genocide prevention efforts. The annual Freedom in the World report is the Freedom House's flagship publication, reporting on political rights and civil liberties for 195 countries and 15 territories. John Bridgeland is a Miller Center Senior Fellow, as well as the founder and CEO of Civic, a bipartisan ideas company in Washington, D.C. He previously served as on President Obama's White House Council for Community Solutions and the White House Domestic Policy Council. Civic's Health Index report explores important trends in civic health and engagement in the United States to better understand the way that communities are organized to define and address public problems. Seema Shah is the head of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance's Democracy Assessment Department. Under her leadership, the department produces a biannual Global State of Democracy report that analyzes global democratic trends and developments. Ian Vasquez is Vice President for International Studies at the Cato Institute and Director of its Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. He is the co-author of the Cato Institute's Human Freedom Index, which presents the state of human freedom in the world based on a broad measure that encompasses personal, civil, and economic freedom. And finally, our conversation will be moderated by Margaret Brennan. In addition to being a UVA alum, she is the moderator, as we all know, of CBS News' Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan and CBS News' Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent. Thank you all for joining us. My apologies in advance. I'll need to duck out before the session ends. But again, deep thanks for joining us. And Margaret, over to you.
All right. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for that introduction. I'm looking forward to our conversation with all of our panelists today and to receiving questions from those of you watching at home, listening at home. which we'll get to later on in the conversation if you want to share those via text. But let's dig right into it today. I think this is such a tremendous moment in time to have this conversation, because what we hear time and again in terms of the framing of the conflict in Ukraine, if you turn to President Biden, it's this sort of existential threat to democratic world order, to democratic values. And if you turn and listen to what President Zelensky of Ukraine said today when he addressed Congress and addressed the United States, he was asking the United States to lead the world in that fight for his democracy. His overarching point was, you need to do more. And so I want to start there, Michael, in terms of how people and how you see this, in terms of the symbolism, in terms of the importance. Does a democratic state like Ukraine deserve the use of force? Do other democratic states need to come to their defense?
Well, thank you, Margaret, for having me, and thank you to the Miller Center. I would just say that Ukraine, I think, is clearly the front line of really the struggle between freedom and autocracy that President Biden has identified. It's not a coincidence that our report, Freedom in the World 2021, came out pretty much on the same day that the Putin regime went into Ukraine. And I think that Vladimir Putin was frankly threatened by the idea of a country on the border of Russia that wanted to be a democracy, was struggling to be a democracy, and had made it clear over the last 30 years that it wanted to be free from Russian subjugation. So I think it's very timely. Our report basically identified that we are in the midst of a global democracy recession, if you will. Every year for the past 16 years, more countries have been experiencing democratic declines. Political rights and civil liberties are declining in more countries every year than those countries that have an improvement. And in the Eurasia region, the Ukraine was a bit of an outlier. It was not a perfect democracy, but it had been going in a better direction than it was 30 years ago, under the Soviet Union. So I very much think Ukraine is the front and center of this issue, and it's in the interest of the free world, if you will, that number one, that Putin be defeated there, and that I think we now understand, based by watching the brave Ukrainians, how important democracy is. And I hope that'll inspire all of us to redouble our efforts to protect democracy around the world and in our own country as well.
But John, if it is that significant, it is that important, putting aside the alliances of NATO or the European Union or other clubs, if you look at it as purely this defense of a democratic state against totalitarianism, are democratic values worthy of being defended by force?
Was that to me, Margaret?
Yes, you, John.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is so interesting. I just finished a book called The Gates of Europe about the history of Ukraine. And since Herodotus, Ukraine has been in the middle of this struggle of empire building, and we're seeing it again. The strain between authoritarian rule and people wanting their democracy and their freedom, and we're in that mix today. The challenge, of course, is, that the instinct is, of course, come to the aid in all ways we can, including militarily, to the Ukrainians. The challenge, of course, is by stepping our toes in the military water too abruptly. History tells us, we just have to read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, how quickly we can lurch into a major world war. I will say, the focus of our energies have been on measuring democratic norms, values, and indicators in the United States. And when I co-chaired the White House Summit on Civic Health, American History and Service in 2003, we had to bring President Vika Freiberger from Latvia over to the United States to talk compellingly about what it was like to live in a country with the absence of democratic norms, because Americans didn't understand how fragile democracy was in this country. And ironically now, we're seeing with after January 6th and the undercutting of democratic norms in recent years, President Zelensky and the Ukrainians ought to be renewing Americans' passion to defend our own system.
So, Ian, does the destruction of one democracy in Ukraine, for example, threaten the health of others?
Well, I think that anytime that freedom goes down somewhere, we all suffer in some way. We all lose some margin of freedom because we aren't able to freely engage with the people who are losing their freedom, and that's a big loss. But I think that the invasion of Ukraine has been a clarifying moment, because one of the things that I'm sure all of our indexes have been tracking is this decline in freedoms, the decline in the robustness of democracies, and what we've seen over the past at least 15 years is in the United States and in other countries, this loss of faith, this loss of confidence in the values and the institutions that have made the United States one of the leading liberal democracies. Mm-hmm. And almost every institution, if you look at Gallup polls or Pew Research polls, from the media to corporations to Congress to the Supreme Court, have seen this decline in trust. And I think that has paved the way for the rise of populism in the United States in both parties, which has not been healthy for U.S. democracy or for liberty. And I oftentimes say that I'm seeing a Latin American movie in the United States, because when you lose trust in these mediating institutions, you go for the strong man, and tribalism erupts. And I think that that's what we're seeing, not only in the United States, but in a lot of parts of the world. And so the clarifying moment in Ukraine is that when you take those polarizations and that kind of authoritarianism to an extreme, you don't only get a loss of freedom within the countries that practice populism and instability and conflict. In the extreme, you get the kind of brutal international conflict that we're seeing in Russia now. And so if there's a silver lining to any of this, is that it has sort of awakened in the West. And I've actually been pleasantly surprised to see this, a reawakening in the values that have made the West different. And mm-hmm. This has painted a stark picture about where does authoritarian populism ultimately lead compared to the liberal democracy, which has produced so much progress and so much well-being, not only in the United States, but all around the world. When the United States loses its elements of liberal democracy, the whole world loses benefits, because freedom itself, and this is something we find in our Human Freedom Index, is strongly related to human progress, to increases in human well-being. And so,
well, I'll get back to the domestic question in a while, because I think that deserves its own extended conversation. But I just want to make the point here, because I constantly hear people argue that the war in Ukraine is showing that democratic institutions and the global world order is not failing because it has strengthened them. I think the counter to that is actually, hasn't it shown they have failed if the intent was to stop something like this ever happening again, to stop a democracy from being taken over by use of force, by a totalitarian state, overwhelming force, one that is exploiting those institutions?
I would like to live in that perfect world, but we don't. And one of the things that we can say, and this has been documented by Steven Pinker at Harvard and other top scholars, is that in this liberal world that we've been living in for the past many decades, we've seen a big decline in international conflict. So one of the reasons that this war stands out and seems to us so anachronistic is because it kind of is. It has been the exception to what has increasingly been the rule of an ever more peaceful world. And so that's one of the reasons why we're shocked about it. And we don't know how this is going to end, but it has not gone well for Russia. And that's one of the lessons out of this. I think that Putin blundered tremendously, and this story is certainly not over.
Mm-hmm. Seema, can you jump in here? Because I would like to get your perspective on, one of the excuses for Ukraine not being welcomed into NATO fully as a member, though they were invited back in 2008, was because their democracy just wasn't good enough yet, that they had too much housekeeping to still be done at home. Do you agree with that? How actually do you rate them as a democracy prior to invasion?
So yes, prior to invasion, Ukraine was, in our classification, considered a mid-range democracy. So it was improving in some areas, but not actually doing so well in other areas. So significant declines over the last decade, we saw in things like checks on government, impartial administration, and things like judicial independence and corruption. And, the corruption issue especially, and the outsized role of oligarchs in the government and in the media, those things have not been sufficiently addressed. And so those scores continue to fall or to stagnate.
Mm-hmm. But then there are NATO members who also have some pretty big problems like that. I'm thinking of Turkey. So when we look at those institutions meant to protect democratic norms, isn't that a problem?
It is a problem. I mean, we don't actually classify Turkey as a democracy at all. We consider it a hybrid regime. So point taken. I think this reveals some sort of reflection that is required in the international community about where do you draw the line, and what do you consider to be your definition of democracy, and how are you going to decide, or how are you going to come up with a plan to apply that fairly?
Mm-hmm. And do you have a suggestion on that? I mean, how do we? Because right now it's kind of, if you're in the club or you're not, right, is literally becoming the deciding point. That bright line the Biden administration has drawn is, if you're in NATO, you will be defended. If you are not, we'll do our best. Wish you luck. We'll pump in billions of dollars, and we will watch and, express moral outrage, and the world will stand with you. But is that what we should expect is that the democratic norm for the defense of democracy? Is that what it looks like, rather than use of force?
I mean, I don't think that's a question that we can answer here, but what I will say is that it's obviously a very difficult calculation to figure out how you decide the risks and opportunities or potential benefits of escalating this war. Mm-hmm. It calls into question everything you're willing to sacrifice. And I'm just not sure that, there's no easy answer to that. And there isn't even consensus about who gets to make that decision, right?
Could I put a word of caution in? I think that we should be very cautious about crusades by the United States to promote democracy around the world. We've had a lot of those experiences, and they have not turned out well. Instead, they have led to endless wars that haven't produced very good results. So I don't think that it makes sense to idealize the ability of the United States or any particular country to go on a democracy crusade. NATO was not set up to promote democracy. It was set up to defend against the Soviet Union. It was a defense mechanism, not a democracy promotion. And I think that there's a danger in this mission creep of trying to convert NATO into something that sounds nice, but in practice could very well be something that promotes rather than reduces conflict.
So you reject the where we started. You reject the characterization of what we're seeing now as a test of democracy versus autocracy, a real hot war example of those two, worldviews sort of clashing. You don't think that's the way to view it?
No, I think that to some extent it's a way to view it, but that does not mean that there is a clear foreign policy answer to response to that. In foreign policy, there are oftentimes not great answers. Then this is one of the cases where that is true. And there are bad answers and worse answers. And the stakes are very high in this case. And in all of world history, whenever you put troops on the border of a great power, that great power is not going to be happy with it. And so we shouldn't be surprised if the United States decides to do that or says that it might do that. The response from a great power is going to be negative. It's going to increase the probabilities of conflict. And so I'm afraid that this is a very tricky situation. We've not gone to war before with a nuclear armed enemy. And I think that the Biden administration is being appropriately cautious, because the moment that it gets in, it can very quickly turn into World War III with terrible consequences all around the world.
Mike, do you want to jump in?
Margaret, if I could just jump in for 1 second. I think we're sort of early in this story. And I think, first of all, the idea that the Biden administration has a binary choice between force and no force is not correct in my view. From what I can see, the administration and its allies have thrown a lot into trying to essentially make Russia and Putin a pariah state. Economic sanctions that we have not seen in our lifetime. Basically, the severing of the Russian government and the Russian people from the world economy. We're really early on, and I think, and they're also talking about various ways of supporting militarily the Ukrainian people. And by the way, the Ukrainian army is doing, from what I can tell, quite well in really fighting very hard against this invasion. And sometimes, the idea, if this is made a broader war, number one, as I think Ian said, it risks an escalation that might not be wise. But number two, it risks making this a war between NATO and Russia, which is not necessarily what we have. And so I think it's early in the game. I do not accept the premise of the question that the United States has sat on the sidelines here.
I didn't say that.
Yeah. But I think that it's not a binary choice, I should say.
No, that's why I was asking, is this the model for how a democracy is defended? Is this the model for Taiwan? When we talk about what the Biden administration would like to do, as the administration before that would like to do, which is look at the great power competition between the United States and China, which is often framed as democracy versus autocracy. Is this the model for when and if Xi Jinping moves on the democracy in Taiwan? Because that is often viewed as, this is the test. What is the defense of democratic values? What does it look like?
Well, I think there's no silver bullet to defending democracy. We worked on a major report at Freedom House with a number of other people, the McCain Institute and CSAS, looking at, there's a lot of non-kinetic tools that are available to democracies, sanctions and other measures like that. You mentioned Taiwan. I think it's an interesting story with Taiwan. Vladimir Putin does not seem to care that every American and international company has basically gotten out of Russia over the last 2 weeks. But I bet you that President Xi is looking at it very carefully. He does care about integration of China in the world economy. And he is seeing now that this—
He's got a lot bigger economy.
Yes. So, but I'm just saying that I think that he may have a different calculation and looking at this differently than President Putin is looking at this.
Can I say one thing on that? We've seen some analysis come out of China recently, which says this exact thing, which is that if China stands to lose a lot if it backs Russia and Russia loses. And so what it needs to do is, they say that they're in a unique position because they feel that they have the power to actually get Putin to back down, and that they should use their power to do that. and that to essentially be on the right side of history, what they're saying right now is that it feels increasingly like it's the whole world against Russia, and they don't want to be on the wrong side of that equation. And one of the things they've said is that they know that the US is paying attention to them, and they want to be able to take the right approach so that they aren't increasingly isolated by the US and its allies in the future. That's been very clear. So I agree. Even though they have not come out to condemn what's been happening, I think they're trying to be much more careful because they see their interests being threatened by what Putin is doing.
They've been deliberately ambiguous. So when you look at that framing of what Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin announced in Beijing at the start of the Olympics, the partnership without limits, the new era, what do you think of that? Because that new era now, it certainly looks like totalitarian states versus Western democracies.
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
I don't think when they made that announcement that I wouldn't imagine that China was necessarily envisioning what we have now, which is trying to take over another sovereign country. So I would say that there are limits to what that new era entails in their mind. And like I said, some of the writing that we've seen come out in terms of policy analysis from inside China says exactly this, that China could win international praise for being seen to promote and support world peace. And that could help prevent isolation in the future, but also that could be a way to improve its relations with the United States and the West. And they're interested in that.
John, I'd like for you to jump in here. You know, one of the criticisms of using the financial warfare tools and essentially isolating Russia to such an extreme they're almost extracted from the global community, even though they're woven into the very fabric of global institutions as a permanent member of the UN and other bodies, is that broader question of what does that do to actually weaken global institutions? Is there a danger here to the democratic world order, the global world order that we hear President Biden talk about, when those tools that were meant to globalize and pull closer together are actually used outwardly as basically as financial warfare?
Yeah, I think we have to do all within our power, and I think you've rightfully pressed, is the Biden administration doing enough? And imposing economic sanctions, having Putin and Russia feel the economic pain is absolutely essential. You know, there is one area, though, Margaret, that I think the U.S. and the Biden administration is actually not doing enough. And yesterday we had a briefing. We started Welcome.us with the former presidents and first ladies in the United States and the refugee community to protect and help resettle 100,000 of our Afghan allies. And on the call yesterday with cabinet officials from Ukraine and the international humanitarian relief organizations, we learned that the humanitarian corridors are not being protected. There are now 3 million refugees who've come out of Ukraine. You know, they've been fighting for their freedom. They're leaving behind husbands and grandfathers to wage war. And yet they're overwhelming European nations. And the UK stepped up right away, provided a safe passage, just like humanitarian parole for Ukrainians. And I think it's incumbent upon democracies in the United States actually create a clear and efficient pathway, given there are more than 1 million Ukrainian Americans in the United States, representing a very powerful diaspora that could welcome these Ukrainians in their home. They speak their language, they share their culture, they share their faiths, and we could surround them with private sponsorship, much as Canada has done for many, many years. And so at Welcome.us, with all these extraordinary leaders in business, nonprofit, the financial community, philanthropy, and our former presidents from Obama back to the Carters, we're pushing hard for the United States to step up and support the people of Ukraine, in addition to the financial, economic, some level of military aid, and the other levers we're pulling. But like Ian and Mike and Seema, I'm very concerned that, our passions to help, particularly Zelensky, who invokes Shakespeare's Hamlet, invokes the never surrender speech from Churchill, and he's exactly right to do so, to fight for his freedom. But we have to be very careful we don't step in a nuclear age into a World War III, which I think is a very, very difficult needle to thread.
Mm-hmm. You don't think that the danger is weakening of those institutions, though?
I think we have to draw a line when you have authoritarian leaders who are basically invading other countries, destroying infrastructure, institutions, taking lives, even not honoring humanitarian corridors. Those are the kinds of leaders and institutions and countries you have to isolate. And I understand at some level it could weaken international institutions and cooperation, but they're not effectively at the table to begin with on terms that are amenable to international cooperation.
Yeah. Well, I can hear Seema in my head, at least, saying, well, what about China here? They have concentration camps, and they're within those institutions and not being isolated. It's Iran, North Korea, and right now Russia that are. But that seems to be a financial conversation. I do want to make sure that we take time to go to domestic issues here before we go to the questions from the audience, because I know we're coming up on that window pretty soon. Around 3:40, I'll start taking those. And I've got my phone here for those texts to come in. But John, can you start us off with that? I mean, even before we got to this, whether you frame it as existential threat to democracy or just a conflict in Europe right now, before that, there was a lot of self-reflection, concern about the state of democracy in the world, and certainly here within the United States. What do you view in terms of what is your view in the level and health of civic engagement in the United States right now?
So interesting. About 20 years ago, I was, kept hearing the reports about our economic health on the radio every day. Housing starts, unemployment, et cetera, but never heard anything about the country's civic health. So we pulled together with Robert Putnam and Pew and a bunch of leaders in the civic health community to produce 40 indicators across 9 categories, sort of an annual civic health checkup for the nation. And what we found is, it's interesting, Robert Putnam wrote a book called The Upswing, saying that the same trends that we actually saw in the Gilded Age in the late 1800s, that when you look at trends in social fragmentation, political polarization, economic inequality, and cultural narcissism, they actually have moved virtually in lockstep since the end of the 1800s. And in the early 1900s, we actually started to see tremendous progress, more economic equality, more political comedy, social cohesion, a culture of we instead of a culture of I, till about the mid-1960s. Unfortunately, most of the trends that we measure have been on the decline, including Americans' participation in civic intermediary institutions like faith-based organizations, civic associations and clubs, political parties at the grassroots level, the decline in local newspapers that used to be kind of a hub for communities to organize, get information, and activate. There are a couple of, a few hopeful trends. There's about a civic corps of about 88 million Americans in the United States who are well informed. They volunteer, they attend public meetings, they work with others to solve community problems. There also is the rise of millennials and the netizens who are using technology in really innovative ways to work together on public challenges. And encouragingly, during economic downturns, low-income Americans in poverty are the most likely to open up their homes, offer food, shelter, other support to Americans in need. So I think we need to build on those sort of core civic assets, including our nation's veterans, whose habits of engagement and, their mission continues in the United States. They continue to serve in a variety of ways, and they too are at the center of a lot of civic renewal.
Seema, how do you rate the United States in terms of the health of its democracy right now?
So our latest round of data showed that the United States is one of 7 backsliding democracies around the world. Over the past decade, there have never been as many backsliding democracies as there are now. 3 are in the EU, but of course, the United States being named one was a very big deal. And the way that we calculate backsliding is when we see a pattern over at least 5 years of significant declines in checks on government and civil liberties. And so that's what we saw in the United States, things like Congress's inability to hold the executive to account, restrictions on freedom of assembly related to police brutality, et cetera. So even though overall the United States is still a high-performing democracy, it is backsliding.
Mm-hmm. Is that recoverable? I mean, are you seeing any kind of shift?
Well, it's hard to say because our latest data hasn't been released yet, but of course it's recoverable. Of course it is. But it takes sort of acknowledgement, first of all, that this is a problem that we need to reflect on and address, and then concerted action to address it. And I think it's a terrible sign that I think in December of last year, 71% of Republicans did not believe that Biden won the election in a legitimate way. He's not a legitimate president. And so it's hard to imagine how you're going to overcome something like drops in the strength of your in the scores on the strength of your legislature when that's how extremely the parties in the legislature are divided.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've talked a lot about that here at home. Ian and Mike, if you have thoughts on this before we go to questions from the audience, please do jump in terms of how you view the health of American democracy.
Well, I'll just say that I think it's in trouble. In our own Human Freedom Index, what we've seen is this long-term decline in the United States level of freedom. It's still among the freest countries in the world, but in 2008, which is when our data begins, it was number 7, and it is now number 15. Given the trends going on in the United States, I think we can expect further declines. We have long-term data on particular indicators going back decades. And for one of them, on our economic freedom indicators, the rule of law, we see the biggest declines, beginning at around the year 2000. And I think that that's due to a lot of factors. Could be the war on terror, the wars in the Middle East, things like the weakening of property rights in the United States, the rise of crony capitalism and perceived crony capitalism, intrusions into people's privacy, that kind of thing that has happened in the United States has really weakened the rule of law. And that's especially worrisome because, of course, the rule of law is one of those foundational indicators for the health of any country. And I think that what's going on is a weakening not only of formal institutions, but also what you might say is the culture of freedom. We're living in a moment of intolerance, and for institutions to survive, they do really have to be backed by a culture that agrees that these are legitimate institutions, or that there's a sort of a shared system of values around the concept of liberal democracy. And so that's what I think we're seeing in the United States, and I'm not hopeful that that's going to turn around in the short term. But maybe Mike has a different view.
No, let me just say quickly, Margaret, because I know you want to get to questions. Our data clearly tracks what Seema and Ian were saying. We are in a downward trajectory in the United States that really we've documented over the last 10 or 11 years. And again, I think we have to put it in some context that on a global scale, we are still a free country, and we have a lot of very positive aspects about our democracy, which including a capacity of self-renewal that you see in some of the civic groups that John works with. I will say, if I just add one thing, because I think it connects back, Margaret, to the point that you're making at the beginning. We care about US democracy for its own right, that we want to have a strong democracy in this country, but it is so crucial to the health of global democracy. People around the world look at how we're handling these issues, for better or for worse. I think about what happened on January 6th in 2021. And, in the week after that, you saw that being a huge propaganda victory for Putin, for Iran, for China. They were really able to point to that as, hey, why are you picking on us? You got really serious problems there. It's really not fair, but it's real. And we work with many human rights activists and journalists all over the world. And they, believe me, they pay attention very closely to what's happening in the United States. So we want to get our own house in order, one, because we need to get our house in order, but number two, I don't believe that global democracy can advance without really strong US engagement on the issue.
So going to questions from people who are listening to you all right now. I have some specifics and then I have some broader ones. Let's start with this one. Democracy and freedom seem to be used interchangeably. Can the panelists comment on the difference or distinctions between democracy and freedom? Ian, I think you actually just referenced freedom quite a bit. Sure. So you want to jump in?
I'll say a few words about that. The viewer is right. These are not the same things. Oftentimes they're interchanged as though they were. In our own Human Freedom Index, what we're measuring are economic and personal civil freedoms, not political freedoms, though we think that that's very important. And one of the reasons is because what we want to do is look at, among other things, at the relationship between the political regime, is it a democracy, a hybrid system, or a dictatorship, or whatever, and the level of freedom that exists. And one of the things that we find is that there's a strong relationship between freedom, individual freedom, and democracy, which is what we expected, but they're not the same thing. And as we know, and as we're seeing, under democracies, people's freedoms can go down, and sometimes they go up. And so I feel like those two different concepts should be measured separately in order to observe those relationships and see what kinds of political regimes, and for that matter, policies, are more consistent with freedom.
Yeah, Margaret, we're both UVA alums, and Thomas Jefferson's mystical notion of the pursuit of happiness wasn't just freedom, wasn't just an individual right. It was also the public happiness he was talking about, which gets to not only the rights, but the responsibilities of living in a democracy. We want citizens, not spectators. And I think we have to remind Americans, in the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about rights and too little about, responsibilities. We worked with Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson in the deep red state of Arkansas on an op-ed that said a mask is a uniform of a responsible citizen. And we have to rescue this notion that it's not just rights, it's also, John Gardner said, rights and responsibilities, liberty and duty, that's the deal. And democracy is not something that just empowers the individual in our rights. It also calls upon us to exercise our duties. And the presidents like Kennedy and others who've awakened that notion, that call to service in the American people, have been fondly remembered for asking ordinary Americans to do extraordinary things, which is the point of democracy. It unleashes innovation and entrepreneurial spirit and creativity in ways that authoritarian states never can.
Mm-hmm. And so much of that is a free press, but also the responsibility of the citizen to stay informed and to seek out a free press and not stay in their bubble. I have a very specific question here to Seema, and I'll add another country to it. But how do you rate Hungary, a member of the EU and NATO, on the scale of rule of law and democratic health? And how would you rate the state of Israel?
So Hungary is one of our 7 backsliding democracies this year, along with the US. And again, we're looking at checks on government and civil liberties when we make that classification. And Hungary's record, especially in something like judicial independence, has been severely battered. And that's one of the reasons why it is now considered backsliding. Israel is considered a democracy in our indices, but there's a lot of controversy over that. And to sort of tie this to the previous question, it's really important to think critically about how you define democracy, and there isn't consensus around that. And there's all kinds of different categorizations of democracy. At IDEA, we take a very broad view. So we look at not just elections and checks on government, we look at things like social group equality and basic welfare. Also, because we consider, you know, if people don't have their basic needs met, can you really call yourself a thriving democracy? And in the case of Israel, you know, the way that it deals with the conflict with the Palestinians obviously impacts that score. And yeah, so I don't know how to say a lot about it without taking up all the rest of the program, but it is considered a democracy today, despite its actions in the occupied territories.
I think because I know President Zelensky is speaking to the Knesset on Sunday and has really hit hard at the idea that that democracy should come to the aid of his democracy, and pointed out the failure to do so in not picking a side. Hungary also so interesting because of what's happening with something John brought up, which was migrants and refugees. But to get to more of these questions, this is a big picture. What role does disinformation play in the erosion of trust in institutions? Anyone want to take that? I could take that, but I won't.
Well, I can try to weigh in there. So, you know, first of all, speaking personally, I'm a former journalist. I worked for many years as a journalist, and let me just say that what you, Margaret, and your colleagues have to deal with today in terms of the kind of media environment is just so different than when I was a reporter starting out in the mid 80s. And so it's just so much easier for, you know, bad actors to spread propaganda, conspiracy theories, inflammatory views. It's just a real problem. You know, where does the truth lie? And I mean, to me, you were talking earlier about the United States. I think, well, I would just say not just the United States, but globally, you know, trying to figure out a way to really push back against this disinformation, support independent, factual-based journalism is really one of the most important challenges facing democracy. Because, like, you think about what's happening in Russia today, just to take the most extreme example, it's kind of crazy, but most people in Russia, you know, are taking Putin's side. They think this is a police action that is going after neo-Nazis, and it really shows that even in an era where we thought the internet would not allow you to control information, that people like Putin, who are bad actors, can really control the information ecosystem. And so I think it's a global problem, and it's particularly a problem also here in the United States.
Definitely. John, I wonder what you think of that, like particularly in the age of COVID and going through that. I would scream internally, at least, when I heard, I just don't know who to trust anymore. I just don't know, you know, well, the news changes every day. And people literally, though, didn't know who to trust, even in terms of well-established journalists versus what they heard from friends versus what they saw on Facebook versus what they heard from elected leaders at the time. And you know that many of those people really strive to be accurate and to be specific and to be accountable for it. But often by consumers of information, they're put on the same platform and viewed as the same thing.
Yeah, you're right.
Thereby elevating bad actors.
Huge challenge. So it was one of the reasons we actually, I co-founded and we formed the COVID Collaborative, which brought together top leaders in health, education, and the economy, including all the former CDC directors, FDA commissioners, secretaries of health and human services at the state and federal levels, together with people in business, people in schools, and then organizations representing the diversity of the country. We had a $250 million vaccination education campaign with the Ed Council. I'll give you one example. Our surveys showed that Black Americans were terrified by the vaccines because of the Tuskegee experimentation by the government back in the 50s. And so we actually reached out to the grandchildren of the Tuskegee Airmen, armed them with good facts and information about vaccines and all the questions we were hearing from Black Americans. And with the NAACP and UNIDO's National Congress of American Indians and other organizations, got those grandchildren on air, and it boosted uptake among Black Americans because they were peers. They were right at the center of the historic trauma, which they had experienced personally through their families, and then armed with good information about vaccines and the merits of them. So that was one creative way we tried to combat what is a very large issue. The CDC, Rochelle Walensky, who we work close with, is amazing, Tony Fauci, but the bureaucracy is heavy, their capacity is limited, and they haven't always kept up with clear and consistent messages that give Americans the information they need. So it's another example of democracy emerging, people across the country with talent, to help their government in a time of crisis.
It seems to me, if I could add something to that, it seems to me that any time that there is a new technology, which is what the world has been living through with the internet and social media, it's going to be disruptive. That was the case with the communication technology called the book that Gutenberg started to print, and it led to the Protestant Reformation and wars of religion. It took a long time to sort of figure out how people were going to live after that disruption, and I think that's what's going on right now. Jacob Machangama in Denmark has just written a global history of free speech. And one of the things that he points out throughout history is that there are these challenges to free speech. When you have free speech, there's going to be moments when people challenge each other, sometimes with very nasty ideas or new ideas. And very often what you see is the elite feeling very uncomfortable about it and trying to do something to limit misinformation or hate speech or continue to maintain some control. But what is also comes out clear from his book is that the best way to fight misinformation and that kind of thing is with more free speech. And so I'm very worried in the United States how both parties are very much in favor of limiting speech right now. The Republicans, because they think big tech is against them. Maybe they're right. The Democrats, because they want to protect people from hateful speech, misinformation, and so on. And this is not just a US phenomenon. It's happening in other parts of the world, and it's a threat to free speech.
Is there any country, Seema, that has been doing better and came out on the other side of this pandemic in a stronger place as a democracy?
We don't rank countries. So overall, it's not like we have a score for each country. We do score different attributes of democracies. And some countries have done really well in certain things and others in other things. South Korea jumps to mind as an example of just really, really strong innovation in terms of how they conducted their pandemic elections and how they dealt with controlling the spread, being transparent, about what they were doing with their citizens. That's one that jumps to mind. I'm trying to think of another one. In Botswana, we saw that when the state of emergency was invoked in the early days, because it was considered such a big deal, they televised the proceedings to decide on that state of emergency so that everyone could see what was going on, especially because the opposition was so critical of implementing that law. And then afterwards, they had a whole review of the process to see what they could learn to make it better for the future. So again, that's a very strong example.
Margaret, if I could just weigh in there, because I think it's a really good question you just asked, or the questioner just asked, because there's hope here. It's not just gloom and doom. And I think people should take away some hope. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. First of all, if you look at places like Myanmar, Sudan, Belarus, to take three, there's been in Hong Kong would be another one. The authoritarians are right now on top, but you've seen over the last several years incredible protests, incredible demand for citizens for democracy. But before China shut down freedom in Hong Kong, 3 million people were out on the streets, demanding that essentially that China live up to the deal that they struck with Great Britain in 1997. And I would also say another country that I also think about is Taiwan. We've been talking about it a little bit in terms of geopolitical points of view, but Taiwan, according to Freedom House scores, and we do rate every country in the world for the level of freedom enjoyed by the people, Taiwan has zoomed up over the last 3 decades from essentially being a military dictatorship to being really one of the freest countries in the world by our scores. And my feeling is, number one, it shows that, the Chinese people, want democracy just the way other people want it. It's not something that's just a Western invention. And that if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. So I really hope that we can ignite a new democratic wave, but we have to really work at it.
I just want to echo that, because what we found in our analysis also was that almost 80% of countries around the world experienced protests during the pandemic, despite restrictions on protests and freedom of assembly. And we found that to be stunning, that the level of demand for democracy was phenomenal, despite all these restrictions.
We found the same trend in our index on freedom in Taiwan. It is really one of the countries that has seen the most increase in freedom in the world. It ranks 19th out of 165 countries today. Just 12 years ago, it was 38. And interestingly, if you look at the Baltic countries, the same phenomenon is happening according to our index. Estonia ranks number 4 now, and just in 2008, it ranked 16. Lithuania and Latvia have a similar pattern.
There's a lot, and we jumped around a lot, but and we left a lot behind, but I think we covered some good ground during this conversation. I think it's a provocative one to have over what does a democracy actually look like when it's functioning, when it's not, and how do you defend it when we're talking about all these vulnerabilities in all these different places. So it's something I know we will continue to watch and report on, and I know all of you will continue studying it, and I want to thank UVA for their dedication to trying to protect and inform about what democracy should be and is. So thanks to everyone for listening today and for your questions as well.
Thank you.